I'm back. So this time I have slides, so be careful. So I know I have a short amount of time because we're running behind. So my topic today is going to be finding purpose through flow. And as you mentioned, the founder of Mehta Labs is focused on all things human potential. We have a research side that focuses on enhanced human states and helping us figure out how to tap in and access our superpowers. And then we have an incubator that focuses on bringing together human potential, grand challenges, and frontier technologies like blockchain that could have a large impact on humanity. So just to take you a little rewind a little bit, how I came to this idea of flow and then how I discovered purpose through it. I used to be on the board of directors for the Florida Space Agency. And I was there during a time when we had 2 years to wind down the space shuttle program to figure out how to launch a commercial space sector, and spent about a year and a half negotiating with the Air Force to carve out a little sliver of airspace for one launch pad, which we finally did in 18 months and gave that to Elon to launch his Falcon 9s out of for SpaceX, which became the beginning of the commercial space sector. Simultaneously, we had a deal with Stephen Hawking, and we created a microgravity research center, which is focused on research around zero-G environments. To inaugurate that, we actually took Stephen up there for a zero-G experience. You can see a little smirk on his face that you normally wouldn't see because this was one of his childhood dreams. And in this process, I was researching programs to put in here. And one of the things I kept running into was Nikola Tesla and his research. And I was super fascinated with his story and just his mindset. I went around looking for different movies or books and things like that to get more information on him. And I couldn't really find much back then. This is in the mid to late 2000s. And so I was inspired to actually write a graphic novel on it myself called The Inventor, based on the true story of Nikola Tesla and his battle with Thomas Edison to power the planet. So during this time, I thought like any young guy that just wrote a graphic novel, what should I do next? Well, let's move to LA and make a movie. So that's what brought me to Los Angeles. And in a short amount of time, about 3 months, I actually ended up with a deal with Lionsgate and started working on developing this into a feature film. And it wasn't until 2012, when we were about to go into full production, that that Lionsgate actually merged with Summit Entertainment, another company, and the entire film side of Lionsgate got fired. All 200 people, including the president who I was working with. So my whole deal just vanished overnight. That's how I felt. And about 2 weeks after that, I ended up getting ill with Lyme disease. So at this time, I had no idea what was going on. My body just started shutting down. I'd wake up with heart palpitations, thinking I was going to have a heart attack. I lost 30 pounds in a month. I was having all sorts of stomach cramp issues. I was having these random bouts of blindness. Pretty much everything you see on this slide and more was what I went through or rotated through. Probably every textbook disease you can imagine. The Lyme disease is a full-blown nervous system disorder, so it masks itself under various symptoms. How many people either here has, or know somebody that has Lyme disease? It's a big, right? Lyme disease is the fastest growing epidemic that nobody's talking about because it's hard to diagnose. There's no good diagnostics. And like I said, it pretends to be something else. So the doctors focus on something else. So I ended up going to every doctor I could find, every specialist. Nobody could figure out what was wrong with me. All my blood tests showed up okay. And they just pretty much concluded that I had anxiety and here's some Prozac. And I knew that wasn't the answer because, like I said, I can't lose 30 pounds in a month, through anxiety. So I didn't have any other places to turn, so I just assumed that, okay, I'm not going to survive 2012. It just kept getting worse and worse. So I thought to myself, well, the last act on this planet for me is going to be to release this comic book at Comic-Con. So I found somebody that was willing to let me use their booth at Comic-Con to release my graphic novel. It's like a cancer patient's last dying wish. He wouldn't argue with me. So I finally got there, and he allocated 3 days of book signings for me. So the first day when I got there, and I don't know if anyone here has been to Comic-Con, but it's 120,000 people, full of lights, sound, music, flashing things. It's super overwhelming, especially if you're not feeling well like me, like I was. So the first day I was actually too ill to even show up to the convention center. Second day I was too nervous to show up. I thought that whole thing would overwhelm my system. The third day, my sister actually comes and drags me there saying, I'm going to regret it if I don't go. And I got there, and there happened to be this whole line of people waiting for me to sign the book. And it turns out about 5 to 8 minutes in me signing the book, with all the love and appreciation and thank yous I was getting, the gratitude, my body felt normal for the first time. My brain fog went away, my solar plexus area felt solid, all the various loose joints and other idiosyncrasies actually tightened up, and it felt like it was before I got sick. I was like, wow, this is what it feels like to be healthy again. About 20 minutes, I felt like I just jumped out of a plane and had an adrenaline rush and felt high. I felt like everything was vibrant again. People looked beautiful. Life looked amazing. I wanted to live. So I went back to Florida, home base, and spent the next 3 years visiting alternative health practitioners, technologists, scientists, anyone on the fringe, to learn as much as I can and try all these different things and turn myself into like a walking lab. And what I realized was every time I tried, it's actually getting better. I tried these different, I guess, practices and techniques to see how people perceive mind, body, and health. And I'd get better, and then I'd plateau. And I'd try something new, and I'd get better, and I'd plateau, and so on and so forth. I kept plateauing. So I got frustrated, and a friend of mine said, hey, you need to talk to another guy that also went through what you went through, a guy named Steven Kotler, and maybe you could exchange some notes. So I said, okay, great. So Steven and I get on the phone, and Steven, turns out, was a guy that wrote a book called The Rise of Superman, which talks about how action-adventure athletes defy death, break world records, do all these crazy superhuman things by accessing flow states. So we're talking about what we went through, then we get to the topic of flow. And one of the things he told me in his research is, hey, one of the things we figured out is novelty drives flow. And I was like, wait a minute, say that again? He goes, yeah, novelty is a driver of flow. So I thought to myself, and it struck a chord, because everything I did, what I realized, had novelty embedded in it. When I tried something new, I started to get better. When the novelty wore off, I'd plateau. Then I tried something new, it got better, and the novelty wore off, I'd plateau. So I realized novelty actually was a very important part of my healing process. So I went head deep into flow states and tried to learn everything I can about flow, experimented with all sorts of things. And I started getting better. And what I figured out was, there's a lot of science behind this, and I don't have the time, I guess, today to talk about it, but these are 3 of the main triggers that drives flow. Novelty, as I mentioned, which has to do with complexity and discovery. Presence, which has to do with clarity of focus and clear, focused attention. And then challenge, which has to do with the challenge and skills ratio. The challenge has to be slightly higher than your skill to keep you moving forward. If it's too hard, then you give up. If it's too easy, you get bored and don't engage. So that challenge and skill ratio has to be hard. And if those things are active, then you can trigger a flow state. And what happened with me is I'd get in these flow states, and then I'd come back down, and I'd be back to where I was, my default state. But my default state was so low that I was non-functional. So my focus became on not worried about how to get into these peak performance moments, but how do I raise my default baseline and function from in a day-to-day moment from that place. So I dug into, well, what is flow? And what I realized is flow is life force, right? Flow is the stuff that we're all made of, and also what binds us all together, and what powers us. It's what keeps us alive. So from that lens of like, okay, so when I'm really working with this life force, and how do I access more of this? So I mentioned before, there are 2 base emotions, and I look at flow or life force, source energy, flow. Another word for it is love. I was talking to somebody earlier about that. And there are 2 base emotions that act on this: fear, and all negative emotions that relate to it are rooted in fear, and then trust, which is what I refer to as all positive emotions like courage, gratitude, humility, things like that emerge through trust. And fear actually contracts our pipeline to access more of this life force, while trust expands our pipe so we get more of it. And the more of it we get, the more we can do. And I noticed when I was doing things that put me in flow, is pushing all these things off my nervous system, all the triggers and toxins and the pathogens off my nervous system that allowed me to function like I was normal. The minute I was not in flow, all those things would come in and take over. So I realized, well, there's more to it than just our emotional state. And that's when I discovered that there's actually a whole framework that I use to help access higher degrees of flow that boosted my immune system and eventually heal myself of Lyme. And when I say heal myself, I'm asymptomatic. I don't have any symptoms, and I've been probably healthier than I was before I even started. So these are just some of the things I discovered. So I called it quantum body just because it sounds cool. So 1, everything's a frequency. I don't need to tell you that. This is an audience that understands that. It's a vibration in space. 2, flow is that space-time fabric that binds everything together and powers everything. So is that shaken space is where the power comes from. And 3, there are 5 gates to how we, as humans, in our human experience, access flow. The first is our physical layer. So that's our physical body, and that's where all the toxins and the muscles and biochemistry takes place. And that's where also the symptomatic layer. I noticed some of my text is off because I translated this from Keynote. But so that's this final symptomatic layer that shows up in the form of disease when something's blocked, when your flow is blocked. Second is your life force. And that's what we talked about, your biofields. And that could be triggered by your breath, by breathing. Pranayama is a very good way of infusing yourself with more life force. But that's your meridians, your nadis, your chakras. And that's a place where flow can be blocked. Third is your mental emotional state, which I talked about earlier, the fear and trust. So that's a place where flow can be accessed or blocked. The fourth is your belief systems or your programming. That's where essentially the stuff that's happened to you since you're born all the way to this moment. We're all programmable beings. I'm programming you. You guys are programming me. Everyone's programming each other throughout their lives. So some of those can actually activate or block your flow. And the fifth is the realm of what I call universal truths. This is where the entire ocean or infinite flow exists. And when we have a belief system that's misaligned with a truth, we get less flow. That generates fear-based emotions, which creates less flow. That creates chakra or meridian blocks, which creates less flow. And then your body gets drops of flow from this ocean of flow available to it. And then whatever drops your body does have, you have the physical toxins that come in, your heavy metals, your chemicals, your pathogens, your food allergens that block your flow even more. And eventually, if you don't address that, you develop disease, atrophy, and die. So the first step for me was to reclaim the flow I already had on the physical level by detoxing and doing things that would generate more flow and remove the things in my body that was in the way, so to speak. And then the second thing was to figure out how to access and broaden my pipeline to get more flow. And that was backward engineering through finding what meridians were blocked, and that would tell me what emotional set I was dealing with. When I knew what emotional set I was dealing with, I could figure out the story that was creating that emotional trigger. If I knew the story, I could regress to figure out where that story first started and figure out what that program and belief system was set. And once I knew where that was happening, I could figure out the assumptions that how that was keeping that belief system in place that ultimately held my perceptual lens away from what I call a universal truth. So the idea is perception is the source of all flow. And the thing between universal truths and the rest of your human experience is that perceptual lens. So all flow, all fear is created through perception and also healed through perception. And what do we do with this perception? So the idea is I envision truth, the universal truth realm, in all these what I call truth bubbles. And these truth bubbles have flow in it. And every time you experience a truth, you have that aha moment, that epiphany, you pop a truth bubble. And when you pop the truth bubble, you own all that flow, your baseline flow profile has just moved up permanently. And then you go and pop another bubble, and you have another aha moment, and your baseline keeps going up. The idea is not to know the truth, it's to experience the truth. And every time I did that, I realized, wow, this is a game. All I need to do is pop truth bubbles, and I'll get better. And that's essentially what happened. And truth follows, or at least flow, and truth follows Moore's law. The more truth bubbles or more flow you have, the more flow you can get. So I realized that, okay, how do I access more flow even in the beginning? And I realized there are 5 areas of how we source flow. And I started optimizing my life in all these areas. Physiology, which is the body, so the diet, the exercise, things of that nature. I started removing all inflammatory things out of my diet, like grains and sugars and dairy and things like that. And I started getting healthier and gave me more energy so I could confront the truths that I needed to access and experience. Mindset, perception, attitude, belief system, programming. That's another area where I started paying attention to all those things and seeing what was serving me and what wasn't serving me. Lifestyle. So these are the things that, when you sleep, your circadian rhythms, your direction, the way you drive to work. I realized I was driving past power lines every day, and I started paying attention to see, well, what makes me feel better and what doesn't? So all the little details that you do in your life and the rhythms you create either help you access more flow or block you from it. Fourth is people. The social dynamics with your family, your friends. The more I was around, I wanted to isolate was what I thought was the right thing to do to protect myself from everyone. But what I realized was when I was around people and I was around social environments, I actually felt normal. I felt better. So it's counterintuitive, but I started engaging in more social activities like yoga classes, like parties and friends and outdoor activities, and I started, getting better. And the fifth is your environment, the air you breathe, the water you drink, even being outdoors in nature, you access flow. So the key to all this was daily staples, the things that you'd see and do and eat every day were the things I analyzed, because those are the things that were either building a toxic load on me or regenerating me. So everything I would feel into to see, is this making me feel better or is it making me feel worse? And I analyzed all that and got rid of the things that were no longer serving me or what I noticed instead of taking it for granted, and then started putting into my life the things that were actually nourishing and regenerating me. So I started moving from a flow state into what I call a state of flow. And I found that there are drivers that actually can enable you on a long-term basis. And here's a few of them. Curiosity is one of those drivers. The more curious you are, it's a natural form of life extension. And we did a mini study that we noticed Tesla, when I was teaching in class, was born in 1852. And there's a bunch of other people who were born in that same realm. And Tesla lived to be 86. Thomas Edison lived to be 84. And all these other people lived to be in their mid-70s, mid-80s, but when I started looking, I was like, wow, that's really weird. That sounds like they were really old. And I looked at the average lifespan for that time frame, people born in the mid-1800s, it was 52. So these people were living 50% longer than the average person down the street. So I attributed it as my gut said, wow, that must be because these guys are insanely curious. They're discovering the mysteries of life and looking at this as a playground. So then I found studies that actually validated that. There's a study that showed people between 55 and 65, about 2,000 people, those that had higher degrees of curiosity lived longer, and those that had less curiosity developed neurogenic diseases earlier and died earlier. And you look at Stephen Hawking as an example. He's supposed to die in his early 20s. He's 70-something years old and still kicking, right? So through all that, the graphic novel, while I was really ill in bed most of the time, ended up becoming a bestseller because school teachers started buying it to engage kids to read and learn and inspire STEM learning. I did a show called Flow. I was like, well, how do I express this into creating a group flow state? And I created this show that was kind of like yoga mixed with Cirque du Soleil to my piano concert. And the idea was I was improvising my performance based on how I engaged the audience, because they were feeding my flow, I was feeding the performers, and the performers were feeding the audience, and we created a group flow dynamic. So the bottom line is flow is connection, right? When you're in flow, you're feeling connected, and ultimately what we're trying to do is become a more connected individually, but also a more connected species, and that's the purpose of technology. It's really to help us integrate into a more connected species that thinks, acts, and moves as one in harmony with each other and the planet. And I'm not the only one that thinks of this. Leonardo da Vinci had a great quote, said, study the science of art, study the art of science, develop your senses, especially learn to see. Realize that everything connects to everything else. He knew, just like we know now, that connection is power. Thank you.